Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for week 3. This channel is intended for half PPR, so if you play in a different format, let me know in the comment section down below if you have a question. But let's get it going. We're going to also reference some stats just like yesterday. This chart right here references every defense in the NFL and shows you which teams are giving up the most and the fewest points to the wide receiver position in fantasy. It's only through 2 games, so these stats will change. It's a very small sample size, but we at least have multiple data points, and just like yesterday, I wanted to bring it up. We'll go through the best and the worst matchups and reference who may be more legit and maybe more fluky depending on who their opponents have been so far this season. So let's talk about the upgrades. The best matchup so far would be the Dallas Cowboys, who go up against Chicago this week. So on paper, you should be upgrading Odunze and DJ Moore, and I think this is legit. While they didn't give up many yards to the Eagles, they gave up a shit ton to the Giants. So I do think the Cowboys will remain in the top 10 for a while, and I do think this week I definitely upgrade the Bears pass catchers against Dallas. They've given up 227 yards per game to the position. Number 2 is their opponent this week. The Chicago Bears also have a terrible secondary, and they've faced the Minnesota Vikings and Detroit Lions. So part of that is skewed by Amon-Ra St. Brown, Isaac Tesla, and Jameson Williams touchdowns last week, 5 of them to be exact. And we can notice that in terms of yardage, the Bears are less vulnerable than Dallas, only 176 yards per game to the position, but that's still above average. That's still a lot. And then a lot of it is based on touchdowns. I would expect CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens to have some success against Chicago. I think that Cowboys-Bears game is more likely a shootout than a low-scoring game. No defense in the secondary from either team so far. The Tennessee Titans also rank very high, but I think this is less legit. While they faced Denver in week 1, they faced off against the Rams last week, and Puka and Davante Adams really torched them. So I do think the Titans will be more league average pretty quickly. They get the Colts this week. So on paper, you want to upgrade Pittman and Downs, but personally in division, I don't think it's a massive upgrade. I think the Rams really skew this. Overall, I'm not dying to test L'Jarius Sneed as if he's one of the worst corners in the NFL. So Pittman and Downs maybe are better starts, but next up in terms of upgrades would be the Giants defense. They've given up a lot of yards to both Washington and Dallas, and they did lock up Terry McLaurin in week 1. So while last week definitely skews these numbers, I think it's relatively legit. I don't fear the Giants that much other than stopping Terry. They've not really stopped anyone. So on Sunday night versus the Chiefs, I think Mahomes will play well. So his receivers get an upgrade. Hollywood Brown and Tyquan Thornton are a bit more trustworthy. However, Xavier Worthy is probably going to suit up. He's expected to practice this week, and I do rank Worthy this week. I think he gets an upgrade if he's active. The Las Vegas Raiders have also been pretty bad in the secondary. Against New England, for some reason, Drake May threw a shit ton of passes. They barely ran the ball. And then last week they faced off against Justin Herbert, who threw a bunch of touchdowns to guys like Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen. So part of that is just who they faced, but in general, the Raiders don't scare you that much in the secondary either. So Deebo and Terry McLaurin, I think, do deserve an upgrade. And then the Patriots defense has also been an upgrade as well. They face off against Pittsburgh, so I think DK Metcalf and Calvin Austin are more interesting. And their opponents have been Las Vegas and Miami. So even though Tua looked like shit against the Colts, Tyreek and Waddle had a decent game in week 2, especially until Christian Gonzalez is healthy. I do think the Patriots is a legit good matchup. But those top 6 have given up over 35 points per game. The next tier is pretty flat, between 33 and 30 points per game. So I'll just mention them loosely. We have the Detroit Lions here as the next best option. They face Baltimore this week. That game's probably a shootout, so I would upgrade Zay Flowers, DeAndre Hopkins, and maybe even Rashad Bateman a little bit. Then the Jags have also been vulnerable, but they did face Cincinnati last week. Against Carolina, they were much better. And this week, they get Houston. So it looks like a bounce-back game for Nico Collins is incoming. I don't know if I trust Jaden Higgins or any other receiver yet, but on paper, I would upgrade Nico Collins. I would also upgrade Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson, get a good matchup here. The Chiefs usually have a good defense, but so far they've been vulnerable to the Chargers and Philly. And last week, Philly didn't throw the ball very much. This is mainly Herbert and the Chargers inflating these numbers. But the Chiefs, most of this is based on touchdown production, only 160 yards per game allowed to the position. So it's a little less legit than I think some of the top 5 matchups. Definitely lower in terms of yardage allowed at just 16 points per game based on yardage. That red dot, I think, points to this being a bit more of a fluke than a legit top 10 matchup. But the last one I'll mention is Houston, who I don't really believe is an upgrade. They faced the Rams in week 1 and then Tampa Bay in week 2. Those are definitely good quarterbacks, good receivers. I don't actually trust Houston, especially Derek Stingley. That's a matchup to avoid. So Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter, I don't think have earned your trust yet. I don't think they get an upgrade against Houston. But on the flip side of this chart, I think the downgrades are a little bit more legit. So far, the worst matchup has been the Seattle Seahawks, who faced San Francisco, who have a depleted wide receiver core right now, so maybe that factors in. And then they also face Pittsburgh, who, other than DK Metcalf, who do you fear? I think matchups are mainly the reason why the Seahawks are so low on this chart. 14.4 points is 2.5 less than the next toughest matchup. So 87 yards per game to the position probably isn't going to repeat. This week they get the Saints, however. Olave and Shaheed are big liabilities in your roster. They have a good secondary. I don't know if they're the best in the NFL, but I do think on the year they'll probably remain in the bottom 10 in terms of matchups. So fade the Saints pass catchers. They go on the road this week. We'll see how Rattler responds. And then Denver does rank second worst in terms of matchups, which is no surprise. They have an elite secondary. They drafted Jahdae Barron. They got Patrick Surtain. Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, and QJ. Probably not as safe this week against Denver, but they've only faced Tennessee and Indianapolis. Definitely their toughest test is here against Justin Herbert. We'll see where they rank next week. I would expect them to move up the list. Third worst matchup would be Carolina, who faced Jacksonville and Arizona. And for some reason, Brian Thomas Jr. is not clicking yet. Arizona doesn't have many receivers either. The Panthers, I don't fear as much, but they do face London and Darnell Mooney, who are both nursing some shoulder injuries. Perhaps they do step up, but I don't actually worry too much about Carolina. I think they're more league average than bottom 5. But the Vikings also rank pretty low. I think they really benefit from last week's game plan where Michael Penix barely threw the ball, and I don't think that they're the worst defense to go up against, but Brian Flores' defense is definitely legit. So Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, I think do deserve a slight downgrade. Trusting Jake Browning is not the safest bet. But Tampa Bay has looked very legit so far. They've locked up Nico Collins. They also locked up Drake London in week 1. And other than an opening drive touchdown for the Texans, there's really been no traction in the passing game against Tampa. So I think Tampa is a very legit downgrade. They rank bottom 5 here, and I think they could move down the list pretty fast. Going up against Tyrod Taylor is not a very difficult spot, so I would definitely downgrade Garrett Wilson. He's not as safe of an option, but there's very few targets in the Jets offense in the first place. You probably still are starting Garrett Wilson. I'm just fading him in terms of expectation. But these next few options I think are all more in league average tier. I don't quite buy that the Commanders are an elite defense against the pass. I think I'm trusting the volume on Jakobi Meyers. I do think he's legit, so I don't worry about Lattimore too much. They faced the Giants and Green Bay, and there were some deep passes for Matthew Golden, and even Jaden Reed almost had a touchdown, if not for a penalty. It could be much worse. They could have ranked way higher on this list. So that one doesn't concern me as much as the graph would suggest. But the next one would be the Chargers, who I do think look elite on defense. I am a Charger fan, so maybe I'm biased, but last year they were the top scoring defense. It looks like it's the same situation this season. So I think Courtland Sutton and Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, not safe bets. Bo Nix has not looked his best so far this year either. So I would downgrade the Broncos against the Chargers. They've faced Kansas City and Las Vegas. Neither quarterback has looked good. There's been no real value other than Hollywood Brown on some deep targets in week 1. So good luck there against the Chargers. The Rams have also looked very elite. They locked up Nico Collins in week 1, so I don't trust this to be a good matchup. And A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are really not safe bets right now. So I would definitely fade them against the LA Rams. I think that's a legit downgrade overall. And then these last two, I also think are fairly legit. The Eagles were very good last year in the secondary. Their corner depth isn't as good this year, but they did stop Dallas pretty well. And then the Chiefs also look like shit against them in the passing game. So I would be worried a little bit about Puka and Adams, but based on their elite production so far, probably not worried enough to bench them. But they do deserve a slight downgrade, just a little bit. And then the last one I also think is kind of scary would be Buffalo. They get the Dolphins this week at home in division. Tua is going to look like shit. So I would not trust Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, even though they had a good game last week against the Patriots. The Bills have locked up the Jets, but maybe Zay Flowers' elite game week 1 does have you less concerned. Perhaps Tyreek can torch them, but that's going to be it for the charts in today's video. These receiver videos usually run a bit long, and I don't think we've had enough data to give you all of the stats on the receiver position. Next week, I'll go a bit more in depth on how these players have performed so far, but through 2 weeks, I'm not quite ready to fully invest in all of the stats on every player. So I'm going to move on. Let's rank the position for week 3. At number 1, I'm going with CeeDee Lamb. At Chicago, we mentioned it, the Bears have a terrible defense, and the volume for CeeDee Lamb is elite. He ranks as the number 2 receiver in terms of targets, and while he has yet to score a touchdown, I would expect that to change this week. The Bears are missing Jaylon Johnson, their top corner. No concerns at all. CeeDee Lamb is going to dominate. He's my number 1 receiver in week 3. At number 2, we're rolling with Amon-Ra St. Brown, who definitely got rid of any concern last week. He had 3 touchdowns. He looked bad in week 1, but that was just because it was the Packers matchup. That's what I'm willing to believe why the Lions look like shit in week 1. And on Monday night, we have a primetime game between the Lions and Ravens. That game's definitely a shootout. I definitely want a piece of it. Anywhere I can get, I'm definitely trusting Amon-Ra St. Brown. At number 3, I'm going to roll with Puka Nacua at Philadelphia. And Puka just looks unguardable. He's such a stud. Opposing defenses have also prioritized Davante Adams in terms of their shadow coverage. So if that trend continues, I wouldn't be worried about Quinyon Mitchell. And this game could also potentially be a shootout at the Eagles. So I'm going to trust Puka. He's been a top 3 receiver in fantasy, and I'm going to rank him that way. I think Puka's elite, and I don't think I'm ever going to fade him outside the top 5 as long as he and Stafford remain healthy. I love Puka this season. At number 4, we got Malik Nabers, who is the highest scoring wide receiver in fantasy through 2 games. And part of that was the Cowboys game last week. I don't know if I would expect 2 touchdowns for him every week, but he also leads the NFL in targets. He's seeing 12.5 per game, and that's the most among any player. The Chiefs can sometimes limit top receivers, but I don't think Nabers is a player to fade. He feels matchup proof, and it looks like Russell Wilson is motivated to throw the ball deep. I like Nabers as a top 5 option all season. He's locked in to the top 4 this week. That is the cutoff point, in my opinion. Those 4 elite options are the best of the best in week 3. But at number 5, I'm going to rank Justin Jefferson versus Cincinnati. And I'm honestly starting to regret my Bengals take. I'm starting to think that the Vikings are actually going to play better with Carson Wentz under center. It can't get much worse. Wentz is reckless at times, but you don't get penalized for the interceptions when you start the receiver. And also, he has way more experience than J.J. McCarthy. So Kevin O'Connell was able to win a game with Josh Dobbs in just 1 practice. Wentz has been with the team for weeks now. And while I am definitely concerned a bit, I'm not going to hit the panic button. I think there's actually more upside for Jefferson this week than what we've seen with J.J. McCarthy. So McCarthy might be out for a month. Until he comes back, I'm going to willingly trust Jefferson to pay off with Carson Wentz. I think Wentz will chuck it deep. And against the Bengals, it's not a tough matchup. I would definitely still start Jefferson, but you might be worried a little bit about his upside this season. At number 6, we also have to worry a little bit about the quarterback change in Cincinnati. So I did drop down Ja'Marr Chase to wide receiver 6, but you're still going to start him. I definitely acknowledge he loses value, but he's still pretty matchup proof and he's still getting elite volume. Last week with Browning, he had a very good game. So the Vikings defense is sometimes troublesome, but I still trust Ja'Marr Chase. It'll probably be a back and forth game between these 2 LSU receivers. So I think Jefferson and Ja'Marr Chase will try and show each other up and play well. I do trust Jamar this week, but because there's T. Higgins to factor in, and that's just not the case for Jefferson, that is why I rank Jamar one spot below Jefferson. I think rest of season, I would still rather have Chase than Jefferson. So this week, you're definitely starting both, but not in that elite tier because of the quarterback situation. And then at 7, I'm going to go back to the well on Nico Collins. I'm not going to panic, even though he's been bad so far. He did score that touchdown on the opening drive last week, and both of his matchups have been very difficult. The Rams look like a great defense. They locked him up pretty easily. And then similar to Drake London, Nico Collins didn't get much going against Tampa Bay. So I think the Bucs defense is actually pretty legit, and that's why I think the scoring will be rectified this week for Nico Collins. I think not only will he score that touchdown, he probably goes over 100 yards, but he's been bad so far, so that's why I can't bump him up above guys like Jamar Chase. And at number 7, he's definitely locked into my lineup, but you have to be just a little worried. If he doesn't play well this week, then maybe CJ Stroud has fallen off quite a bit. At number 8, we got JSN, and I feel like JSN is locked into the top 10 rest of the season. He's 3rd in the NFL in targets, and while he's yet to score a touchdown, that'll inevitably hit. At some point, he will find pay dirt. So I love what I'm seeing from JSN. He's locked into the number 1 target for Sam Darnold. And if you look at his stats, he's basically lockstep with CeeDee Lamb across the board. So while I don't trust his quarterback as much, I definitely trust JSN's talent. And based on the volume, there's no way you're going to fade him. Versus New Orleans, I think he plays well. I think he's a very good start. At worst, he'll put up top 20 numbers just based on volume and yardage alone. He's averaging 113 yards per game through the first 2 weeks. I think it's legit. I don't think it's going to fall off very much. So love JSN. At some point, the touchdown will hit, and he will have that 20-point ceiling available to him when it does. At number 9, we're starting Rome Odunze this week for sure. Rome looks like the only thing in Chicago that's working. His connection with Caleb Williams is really the only thing I think Caleb focused on in the offseason. So I do trust Rome. His production has been very good. And like we mentioned earlier in the video, Dallas has the best matchup in terms of secondaries you can go up against. So love this upgrade for Rome Odunze. They went into overtime last week, so they're probably going to be a bit tired for this one as the game goes on. And not just Malik Nabers torched them, but also Wan'Dale Robinson. So the volume's been phenomenal for Rome Odunze. He's currently top 5 in scoring so far in fantasy, and I don't think it's a fluke. I think they drafted him top 10 for a reason. They're going to use him, and I definitely think he's well above DJ Moore in the pecking order. So love Rome Odunze this week. Love the matchup. Love everything in Chicago pointing in his direction. They have a bad defense, and they will need to throw the ball a lot. Caleb Williams seems to love him. So love Rome Odunze. Definitely a must start in week 3. And at number 10, I think Xavier Worthy is also a must start. He's listed as questionable, expected to practice today. As I'm recording, I don't know for sure if that happened, but I believe it did. And last week, he started to get going. They just held him out, I think more so for precautionary reasons. And on Sunday night, I do think he will be on the field. So as long as he's there, you know, he's getting a ton of targets. They're going to be down the field, and I don't expect the Chiefs to go 0-3. So Mahomes will fight for the win, and Worthy will be the main option. He'll be their best target. If he's healthy, he's a must start with Rashee Rice suspended. At number 11, we got Drake London at Carolina. And I'll be honest, this ranking does scare me a bit. There's a chance he flounders like he has the first 2 games. But I think last week's low passing volume was game plan specific, trying to make sure Michael Penix doesn't get overwhelmed, and also just leaning into Bijan against the Vikings, I think was a wise decision. Coming off the shoulder injury, I think that does factor in as well. So London will be healthier 2 weeks removed from the shoulder, and I do think against Carolina, he'll step up. London is tied for 12th in targets among all NFL wide receivers, and that's what I'm going to trust. I rank him top 12 because I trust the volume to continue. And same goes for Mike Evans, who's also top 12 in targets with Drake London. They're both tied at 9.5 targets per game. The only problem for Evans is that he's gotten unlucky in terms of matchups. He's had the Texans last week. Derek Stingley is not an easy matchup at all. And then in week 1, they got the Falcons, and the Falcons let Egbuka score the touchdowns, not him. So this week, he also gets unlucky. He gets Sauce Gardner and the Jets. But despite his lack of production in the touchdown department, I expect him to step up and put up good numbers. I would still be starting Evans based on the volume and based on his talent. It will click and work out inevitably. I think this week in their home opener, he will find the end zone. I think he will score a touchdown. I think Evans is going to be fine in this game. I don't actually fear Sauce Gardner that much. I feel like Gardner has been a little overrated the last year or so. Against Evans, I don't think he'll completely be shut down. So I think Evans will find the end zone, and I believe the volume is good enough to trust. I would definitely start Evans. I would also start Egbuka, though. Egbuka's been scoring a lot of touchdowns, and although he got a little banged up in week 2, I'm not worried about it. He's a young guy, and he'll be fine. Baker is just such a safe bet to throw touchdowns, and at least until Godwin returns, I really trust the volume to continue for Egbuka, especially in the touchdown department. I think it's a very safe bet. So Egbuka has been touchdown dependent. I will acknowledge that. But because of Evans' bad matchups, I think this week it will continue. I think to avoid Sauce Gardner, Baker will look in his direction, and Egbuka probably turns one of those targets into a touchdown. It's happened 3 times in 2 games so far. So definitely start both Bucks receivers. Things will work out for Evans soon enough. And then I also think I've seen enough from Zay Flowers to where I don't want to bench him. I think the volume is legit. He's currently tied for 9th in targets with 10 targets per game. And if you've been benching him, if you didn't believe in his success, then you've been regretting it the first 2 games. He's been phenomenal. He's been wide receiver 6 in fantasy so far. And against the Lions, I don't fear their secondary. I think it's a shootout in primetime on Monday. So I believe Zay Flowers is a lock in your lineup right now. I don't think there's any reason to fade him, especially until Likely returns. There's not enough dynamic weapons in this passing game. And last week, 2 touchdowns went to Devontae Walker. Another went to Tylan Wallace. And I do think they're using Flowers consistently enough where those touchdowns will start to hit pretty often for Mr. Flowers. So like him a lot. I think the upside is truly elite. And based on volume, you can kind of predict like at least 80 yards per game from him. Whenever he gets 8+ targets, he actually averages over 17 fantasy points per game dating back to last year. The only problem for him is volume. And right now, it's there. I would trust it. I would start Flowers against the Lions in week 3. I would also start Deebo Samuel versus Las Vegas in week 3. Deebo's averaging 9 targets per game, and he looks like the focal point of their offense right now. It's kind of a gadget role that he occupies, but it is working, and he does have 2 touchdowns in 2 games. So even though Mariota is potentially going to be the quarterback this week, and that is a downgrade, it's not a downgrade by a mile. Last year, the Commanders' offense was still pretty productive with Mariota under center. So while I am worried that maybe Mariota favors Terry McLaurin, I've seen enough from Deebo to trust him, and I think especially with Eckler going down, they don't have good enough running backs to fully trust. And if Daniels is going to miss, then I think they need Deebo to step up in the run game. So I think betting on a touchdown for Deebo is a very safe option. I thought he was going to be a top 30 receiver entering the year, and now he's looking like a top 20 player overall at the position. So love him for the yak potential. Mariota can definitely check it down and let Deebo run for another 20-30 yards. I think he's a fine start. I definitely trust him more than Terry right now, and given the holdout for Terry, it may be some time before Terry gets going. So right now, in Washington, I fully trust Deebo, and I think locked into the top 15, he is a must start in your lineup. So those are the tier 2 players, wide receivers 5 through 15, I think are all locks in your lineup. And moving forward, we are kind of entering more of the flex territory, but still on the much higher end of the spectrum. And I think based on volume and touchdown upside, these next 10 players are definitely guys I would want to start in week 3. Davante Adams looked phenomenal last week against Tennessee, and although opponents are mainly prioritizing him with their top cornerback, last week it didn't matter. He looked amazing in the second half. Even if Quinyon Mitchell is guarding him for most of the game, I still trust him. I think Adams is a pretty safe bet for touchdowns. They have not been going to Kyren Williams like crazy, and at the end of the day, it's the Rams offense with Sean McVay and Stafford. They're going to score points. So I would still be starting Davante Adams, even though Quinyon Mitchell is a bit concerning. I think he'll find the end zone. I think that'll cover any of the lack in production from Adams. If he wasn't facing the Eagles, I would probably rank him top 10. He's actually averaging a lot of volume. 10.5 targets per game so far is top 10 at the position. So I would feel really happy if I drafted him. I was really high on Adams this year, and it's paying off quickly. Love him as a must start. At worst, he's top 20, even though the Eagles matchup is a downgrade on paper. At 17, we got Jameson Williams at Baltimore, and ranked him as a top 20 receiver entering the year. Last year he was top 20 as well, and it looks like he will remain that if the upside continues. Week 1 was brutal, but against the Packers, a lot of teams are going to look bad this year. And last week was elite. But the only major red flag for JMO is the volume. Only 4.5 targets per game through the first 2 weeks. But he can score from anywhere. He can offer a 60-yard touchdown 80% of the time. And against the Ravens, I would expect a shootout. I think they're going to trail and need to pass. I think JMO will hit on some deep passes. So I want a piece of this game wherever I can get it. I think JMO's a must start. I would expect JMO to find the end zone yet again. At number 18, we're also going to bet on another high-scoring game with a bad defensive matchup. DJ Moore against Dallas is probably going to dominate just like Wan'Dale Robinson did. So I would expect a very high outcome from both Bears receivers this week. I love Odunze as a top 10 play, but I also think DJ Moore will step up as well. I think this is going to be a very high scoring game. And I think given their 0-2, Ben Johnson will have this offense humming. So I'm a little worried about Caleb Williams and his connection with anyone other than Odunze, but DJ Moore has been consistent enough over his career where I'm willing to trust him. And if we go back to week 1, there was like a 40-yard touchdown that just got overthrown slightly. If it had hit, then DJ Moore would have been elite in week 1. I think this week it will hit and he will have that elite ceiling yet again. I would like to start DJ Moore with a lot of confidence in this game. And I also think the number 2 receiver in Dallas is going to have a good game. The Bears defense is top 2 in terms of matchups. So I'm starting both top 2 receivers in this matchup for both teams. I have George Pickens ranked top 20 just behind DJ Moore. I think he's also going to find the end zone. I think the upside is very high for all the receivers in this game. I trust Dak to capitalize. Last week we saw the upside for Pickens, and I think it clicks again. Give me Pickens as a top 20 play in week 3. At number 20, I have Jakobi Meyers of the Raiders going up against Washington on the road. And I think Meyers is one of the most underrated players in fantasy right now. He's currently wide receiver 19 in points per game, and he also has not scored a touchdown. So if he can find the end zone, he's going to have elite upside. And he's also wide receiver 5 in targets per game. He's currently averaging 11 targets per game through the first 2 weeks. And given the Brock Bowers knee injury, I think it's a legit bet to make that is not going to go away from him. I think Geno Smith is going to look a lot better than he did last week. The Chargers are a bad matchup. The Commanders, I don't think, are as difficult. So I think Geno will look much better, and I trust that Meyers is going to be, at worst, the number 2 target. But with Bowers' injury, it could be just like last week where Meyers is the most targeted option on the field. So love the volume. In terms of floor plays, I think he has one of the highest guarantees you can find. 11 targets per game is top 5 at the position. So love Jakobi Meyers. He looks like a potential steal of the draft. I do think he's a safe play until this volume goes away from him. And I would not bet for it to change. I think he's going to be at least getting 9 targets every week. In the Las Vegas system, they throw the ball quite a lot. At 21, we got Tetairoa McMillan of the Panthers going up against the Falcons this week. And last week, the Falcons defense did look amazing against JJ McCarthy. But I think it was mainly just McCarthy being so bad, not that Jefferson got locked up because the Falcons secondary is elite. And I'm willing to trust the volume for Tetairoa McMillan so far. Right now, he's currently wide receiver 22 in fantasy points, and he also ranks top 12 in targets. Last week, he had 100 yards receiving. Multiple touchdowns went to other receivers in Carolina. So soon enough, there's going to be plenty of touchdowns for Tetairoa McMillan as well. And if we go back to last year, the last game that Bryce Young played against Atlanta, that game went into overtime. The final score was 44-38. So this could be a very high scoring game, kind of an underrated shootout potential here. And I do think Tetairoa McMillan is a player to trust. There's really limited target competition for him, and I think the volume is pretty locked in. I think the safe floor bet is there with both Jakobi Meyers and Tetairoa McMillan. They're both top 12 in targets so far. And at 22, another player that's locked into a lot of volume would be Garrett Wilson. This week against Tampa Bay, however, does scare me. They've had a very good defense so far. They've locked up Drake London. They also limited Nico Collins pretty well. Other than that opening drive touchdown, Nico kind of looked like shit. So Garrett Wilson has to trust Tyrod Taylor this week. And while maybe some of those scrambles that Fields was offering turn into targets for Garrett Wilson, I don't think they're going to be as deep down the field, and I'm also pretty reluctant to believe that there's many touchdowns for the Jets this week. So I'm worried about Garrett Wilson, to be honest. I think this rank might still be too high, but all year long, he's probably a player you just have to start based on the lack of target competition. Just like Tetairoa McMillan and Jakobi Meyers, you're probably banking 9-10 targets for Wilson, and that offers a very safe floor most of the time. So I would still start him. He's more in the low-end wide receiver 2 category this week, though. The Bucs, I think, are a matchup to avoid. This week is probably going to confirm that. I am worried about Garrett Wilson this week. At 23 and 24, I have both of the Chargers' top 2 receivers, and I'm actually ranking Keenan Allen above Ladd McConkey this week. For obvious reasons, Ladd should be faded. He's going up against Pat Surtain most likely, and maybe Surtain does travel and cover Keenan a little bit more. But I think Ladd is the player you want to be focusing on the most, and based on the first 2 games, I think that's the main reason why he has not scored a touchdown. Quentin Johnston has scored 3 times, Keenan has scored twice, and I think it's just because their opponents have tried to lock up Ladd McConkey. He's the most talented receiver they have, and at some point things will work out for him. Last time he faced Denver, he did have 6 catches on 6 targets for 87 yards, but did not find the end zone. So he had 11.7 points. That's kind of what you're hoping for in this game. I think it's kind of hard to bet that Ladd is guaranteed to score a touchdown given he's going up against Patrick Surtain. Even if it's not Surtain, Jahdae Barron was a first-round pick, a pretty good rookie corner to fear as well. So that's why I rank Keenan above Ladd. I think his matchup is going to be a little less difficult. And for some reason, teams are forgetting about him. There's been a lot of plays where he gets the ball and he's just wide open that might continue given Quentin Johnston also a deep threat to keep in mind. So I think Keenan gets easier coverage. That's why I think he's a better play this week, but I would still be starting Ladd McConkey. Even with the downgrade, I think he's just a little too good to fully fade. And at wide receiver 24, he's a bit more in the flex conversation, but I would still start Ladd. In their home opener, it feels like a good spot to get him a red zone target. So I think he might find the end zone, but could also struggle. Last year, though, against Denver, he did offer just shy of 12 points, and I think both players will go over that threshold this week. I think they're both safe options just because Herbert looks like an MVP candidate 2 weeks into the season. At 25, the last player I have in this territory where I am projecting over 12 points is Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jaguars. And he is technically questionable, but I am expecting him to play later on in the week. We'll find out for sure how much he's practicing. And I do think he'll be on the field. But the connection between him and Trevor Lawrence is just not right. Something is clearly off. And he looks lazy at times. Some of his film is really bad. He looks afraid to get hit. I definitely have reason to hit the panic button, but he's just too good in my opinion. Last year he was so productive, and maybe it's just Trevor Lawrence. Maybe Mac Jones is actually that good. It's really hard to rank him outside the top 20, and I did do that against Derek Stingley. I think it's also a matchup to avoid, but he's just too talented. He can also drop a 60-yard touchdown at any time. I think inevitably one of those deep targets will hit. So I would still start Brian Thomas Jr., but to pretend like I'm not worried would be a lie. And that's why he's well below where I expected to rank him entering the season. He's not looking like a top 10 receiver at all right now, but he's still getting the volume, 9.5 targets per game on average so far. The big problem, though, is that it's only turning into 2.5 catches per game. That's terrible. That is fucking atrocious from Brian Thomas. So he only needs one play. That's why I'm still a little optimistic, but damn, if he doesn't show up this week, you gotta be worried. The Texans matchup is also a really tough spot. I could see him completely burning you for the 3rd week in a row, but I think I'm going to start him. I think I just kind of have to based on draft capital. Odds are you don't have enough depth to bench him. But next up, at 26, I think we're dropping down a tier, and these players are definitely in the flex conversation. I don't think they have that elite ceiling that locks them into your lineup, but I will start T. Higgins with relative confidence At the Vikings, I think they'll focus a bit more on Ja'Marr Chase, and I do think T. Higgins is still viable to score a touchdown. If we look at his 6 career games when Jake Browning is the quarterback, T. Higgins is averaging 11.9 points per game. The volume isn't high, only 5.5 targets per game. 3 catches for 64 yards is fine, but where I'm willing to trust T. Higgins is the fact that he's also scored 4 touchdowns in those 6 games. Browning actually favors T. Higgins in the end zone compared to Ja'Marr Chase. So last week, both of them scored a touchdown and both of them looked fine. I still think T. Higgins is a decent play, but to pretend like he's a top 12 receiver while Burrow is out would be a big lie. I don't think he's as safe anywhere near as much with Browning. So I am downgrading him a little bit. I kind of want to flip my pick. I took the Bengals after I learned that McCarthy was getting benched, and now I'm kind of wavering. But I think offense is not the main problem for this game. I think in general, T. Higgins and Ja'Marr Chase will be fine. But if there's one I'm worried about, it would be T. Higgins. The volume has not been amazing in games with Jake Browning. Only 5.5 targets per game. Kind of low. At 27, we got DK Metcalf at New England, and as long as Christian Gonzalez remains out, then I do not fear the Patriots secondary at all. They gave up a lot of points to Waddle and Tyreek Hill last week, and I think Aaron Rodgers has also looked pretty good so far. The Seahawks defense is really good, and I think they'll bounce back off a weird loss that can mostly be blamed on the Caleb Johnson special teams mishap. So I think Metcalf will play well. He scored a touchdown last week, but so far is only averaging 10 points per game, and that's tied with guys like Ricky Pearsall, Tyreek Hill. There's upside, but so far Metcalf has just been like a safe floor play. I think that's kind of the same bet this week. You're probably getting 10 points, but without a touchdown, you probably won't crack 12. I don't think there's enough volume so far to feel like Metcalf is locked in to the top 20. But like I mentioned, he's averaging the same amount of points as Ricky Pearsall, and I got him ranked back-to-back with Ricky Pearsall as well, who I also have right above Juwan Jennings, his teammate. So both Niners receivers I would start as top 30 options this week. At 28-29, Pearsall and Juwan, I have back-to-back. And the division game might be low scoring, but if you look into the depth chart for Arizona, both of their top corners are injured, and I have a feeling that Will Johnson and Max Melton are not going to be available in this week. So I may switch my pick. I may actually pick the Niners to beat Arizona. And last week, Juwan Jennings was pretty productive with Mac Jones under center. So I do think both of them can be fine with the backup quarterback. I'm not going to panic. I trust Kyle Shanahan to dial up good plays, and Mac Jones can deliver the ball. If we look back to last year, Brian Thomas Jr. put up his best stats with Mac Jones. So I'm not going to panic on Mac Jones, and with the injuries in the secondary for the Cardinals, I have no reason to panic on Ricky Pearsall or Juwan Jennings. But Pearsall has more yardage. Juwan Jennings has 1 extra target and a touchdown, but they are both tied at 10 points per game. They've both been equally as valuable through 2 weeks. So I'm going to prefer the yardage with Pearsall. Oftentimes the Niners flip-flop on who is their main target. It's kind of game plan specific. If last week it was Juwan Jennings, I could easily see it pivot to Pearsall in this game. So I will rank Pearsall higher, but back-to-back I would be starting both with the same confidence. I view them identically entering this game, and I think they're safe flex plays this week against Arizona. At 30, I got Calvin Ridley versus the Colts, and Ridley has drawn 2 of the most difficult matchups in his first 2 games. I believe he's going to look much better the rest of the year. I traded for him. I bought low. I got rid of Alvin Kamara, and so far, I don't look good for making that trade. Kamara definitely played much better than Ridley last week. I do expect Ridley to look way more productive rest of the season. I think Cam Ward is going to figure things out quickly, and against a easier matchup, I do think Cam Ward will get Ridley the ball a lot more. He's been bad the first 2 games, but I think he'll bounce back pretty soon. So I think this is the week. He's played against the Colts 4 times in the last 2 years. He's been in this division for a while, and I will acknowledge he actually plays terrible at home against the Colts. In his 2 home games, he's averaging 8 targets per game, only 2 catches per game, 15 yards per game, and no touchdown. That's 2.5 points per game against the Colts at home. But one of those games, he put up a bagel last year in week 6 with Will Levis at quarterback, and DeAndre Hopkins was still with the team. So I kind of want to throw that game out. It's relevant, but not something I believe is repeatable. If we look at his 2 road games, however, against the Colts, he has crushed them. In 2 games at Indianapolis, he has 8 targets per game, so the same volume, but he turned it into 5.5 catches per game for 90 yards per game and scored a touchdown in both of those matchups as well, an average of 17.8 points per game on the road at the Colts. So this game is at home. Maybe he's a major bust candidate. I acknowledge there is some risk here with Ridley. He's in the flex conversation for a reason, but there's also massive boom potential. He could offer you another 18-point game like he has put up twice against the Colts in the last 2 seasons. So I trust the volume. I expect 8 targets here for Ridley, and I do think Cam Ward is going to look way better than Will Levis. So I'm definitely not expecting a bagel. I think Ridley will be fine. Although Courtland Sutton got really locked up last week against Indianapolis, I'm not willing to fully believe that they're a matchup to fade. Troy Franklin did kind of burn them. So I think Ridley's going to be good. I think at some point the volume will carry him, and sooner or later, Cam Ward will get him the ball, and it'll be a good option in fantasy. I think this week it starts to change. Give me Ridley as a top 30 option, a good flex play, in my opinion. At number 31 in the same matchup, I have Michael Pittman at Tennessee, and he was amazing in week 1, then very mediocre in week 2, but that was against Patrick Surtain. That was as expected for him to fall back down to earth. But Daniel Jones looks fairly legit so far, so I wouldn't be that worried. And on paper, Tennessee is a top 3 matchup so far, but part of that is just because Puka and Adams totally demolished them last week. So I don't think it's as big of an upgrade as it would suggest on paper. And if we look back to the last 4 games versus the Titans, Michael Pittman is averaging 10.9 points per game, an average of 7.8 targets, 5.3 catches, 53 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. So similar to Ridley, he has had some success, but it is a bit touchdown dependent. I'm willing to trust the floor on Pittman this week. Daniel Jones has looked good enough where I'm willing to trust his top target. At 32, and the flex conversation as well, would be Courtland Sutton at the Chargers. And Sutton was terrible in week 2, only 1 catch for 6 yards. I was wrong to endorse him as a top 20 play, but it was surprising their top cornerback was injured, and instead Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims had pretty good games. So it may have been game plan specific. It may have just been a bad matchup. I'm not totally sure why Bo Nix didn't target him very much, but I would expect that to come back to him pretty soon. So I'm going to trust that he's still the number 1 target in Denver, but this matchup against the Chargers does worry me. They've been really good so far this year, and I don't think anything's going to change. Last season, Sutton wasn't elite against Jesse Minter's defense and the Chargers. They held him to just 10.4 points per game in half PPR, an average of 6 targets, 4.5 catches, only 52 yards per game, and a touchdown. In both games, he had about 53 yards. He wasn't amazing, and the touchdown was pretty critical. So I believe Sutton is just a floor play this week, but I do think Bo Nix will get back to him. I think this game is kind of a must-win for them to have any shot at the division. I think they need to start winning against these division rivals. So I worry about them actually winning the game, but I think Sutton will find the end zone. I think he's the safest bet in general in Denver to actually find the end zone. I will keep him in the lineup, but at 32, he's just a flex play. You don't have to do it if you have better options. At 33 and 34, it feels very strange to rank them this low, but I have both of the Eagles wide receivers at home versus the Rams, and oh God, I'm really worried about A.J. Brown. He looks like shit. They're not using him very much. He ranks as wide receiver 61 in points, and it's not a fluke. He only ranks as wide receiver 56 in targets. They are just not getting him the ball anywhere near as much as we would have thought. But against the Rams, they've had an elite defense so far. It's possible those trends continue, but odds are he bounces back. At some point, he will break out for that big touchdown and have a great game. He's too talented to be this bad for too long. So I still would probably try and get him in the lineup, but damn, it feels really risky. He just looks so bad and uninvolved. I don't really know what the new offensive coordinator is really doing. So while Saquon has dominated the Rams in 2 games last year, I still think A.J. Brown will be needed to win. And I'm willing to bet that one of these players does find the end zone, does score a touchdown. But it's not a safe bet on which one. Davante Smith has been more targeted down the field. And if you told me Davante has the good game, A.J. Brown looks like shit again, wouldn't be that surprised. So I don't know what to make of the Eagles pass catchers right now. Jalen Hurts is just not being asked to throw the ball very much. But at some point he will. At some point it will work out. And maybe it's this week against the Rams. It's probably going to turn in to a shootout. But both teams have good defenses. It's possible that's incorrect. And if we look back to last year in 2 games against LA, A.J. Brown did have 1 game in the regular season where he was very productive. He had 6 catches, 109 yards, and a touchdown against the Rams in week 12. However, Davante Smith was inactive for that game, so that definitely played a factor. And then if we go into the playoff game in the snow, both receivers were pretty bad. A.J. Brown only had 2 catches for 14 yards, and Davante Smith had 4 catches for 21 yards. So they can win without them. It doesn't need to be a high-scoring game. If anything, I think they're going to lean on Saquon. He ran for over 200 yards in both games against the Rams last season. So good luck here. I have very big red flags on both options, and I would be trying to bench them if I could, but in the top 35, I do think they're decent flex plays, but I would hit the panic button if they don't bounce back pretty soon. I'm very concerned about both guys this week. At 35, I got Terry McLaurin, the last player in this tier, and I would probably bench Terry, but I do think he'll be fine. Even without Jaden Daniels, I think Mariota will still distribute the ball pretty well, and they have a lot of rest for this matchup. I think the added practice time will benefit Terry, who's been bad so far, but was rusty because of the holdout and his contract situation. So I'm not going to elevate Terry much higher than his production would suggest so far. Right now he ranks as wide receiver 65 in points, but he also ranks as wide receiver 33 in targets. So I'm going to rank him right around there, wide receiver 35 with a slight downgrade in quarterback. I think the mini buy benefits him, but not enough to fully trust. He's not a top 25 play, not the guy you expected when you drafted him in the top 4 rounds. Moving forward though, I would want to bench these players more likely than not. I have Tyreek Hill at 36, and at Buffalo, I got a bad feeling that this game is going to be a shutout in favor of Buffalo. I'm really worried about Tua looking like shit in this matchup. And if we look at the last 4 games for Tyreek Hill versus the Bills, he's not amazing, only averaging 9.8 points per game and only 1 touchdown in those 4 matchups. So he's probably just a floor play this week. I think the Bills can definitely shut him down, and the Bills have had a good defense so far. They really locked up Garrett Wilson. I could definitely see them shut down the entire offense of the Dolphins on Thursday night. So not dying to trust him, but he does have some talent. He can always bust open an explosive play that goes for like 50 yards. He still has some speed, and it may be on display at some point in this game, but not safe enough to trust. Last year, he wasn't a top 30 player in points per game at the position either. And this year, I don't think he will be again. I think unless he gets traded, he's just not a very safe option in fantasy. So maybe you trust last week to repeat. I do not, however. I think this Bills matchup is much more difficult, and I would probably bench Tyreek Hill if I could. At 37, I have Quentin Johnston versus Denver. So to rank QJ back-to-back with Tyreek Hill is emblematic of how bad it's gotten. But Quentin Johnston is very touchdown dependent. He scored 3 touchdowns, and most of them have been on deep passes as well. So if you remove those plays, he's pretty unusable, but the upside is still there. I think it's kind of legit. The volume hasn't been bad, and given all the defensive attention that has to be focused on Lad McConkey and even Keenan Allen, at some point Quentin Johnston will consistently get open, and he's not been dropping passes. So because he plays with Justin Herbert, an MVP candidate, that offers him that elite ceiling. He's been a top 5 player in fantasy so far, and at 37, I might be ranking him 20 spots too low. It's possible he outscores both Keenan and Lad McConkey for the 3rd straight week in a row. Last year, he led the team in touchdowns. It's possible it happens again. At 38, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. at San Francisco. And last year in 2 games versus the Niners, he only averaged 9.8 points. So similar to Tyreek Hill, I think he's just a floor play. And he also scored 1 touchdown in that sample size. So without the touchdown, you're looking at less than 7 points. Just like last week, Harrison is clearly touchdown dependent. The volume has not been high enough with Kyler this year for me to trust him. So I was optimistic the first 2 weeks. I'm already down to neutral, and if he shits the bed this week, I'm going to be very pessimistic on him. I was never a Harrison truther, and I don't believe he actually has much consistent value in fantasy rest of season. So I don't want to bet on it. You need the touchdown, and against the Niners, I think it's probably a more low-scoring game. In division, not my favorite spot to trust. Marvin Harrison Jr. At 39, we got Wan'Dale Robinson versus the Chiefs, and I would like to see it happen again. Last week, Wan'Dale was a revelation, and I just don't fully trust that Russell Wilson is going to chuck it deep and hit on Wan'Dale with those deep passes on a weekly basis. But where I think Wan'Dale is legit is the volume. He's averaging 9 targets per game. That's the same as Garrett Wilson. For now, it looks like he's a very safe floor play. In general, and especially in full PPR leagues, he's been a consistent high-end floor option every single week. He's bust-proof. He's always going to give you at least 7+ points. And if last week the ceiling is something that can be offered consistently, then he will be in the flex conversation pretty often. So I like his upside, but I want to see it happen again before I rank him as a safe bet. In the top 40, though, he has undeniable value. I would understand if you started him just for the sake of preventing a bust in your starting lineup. There's no way Wan'Dale has a terrible game. Even against the Chiefs, I think they'll have their hands full with Nabers. He does get open and does put up decent stats. I think Wan'Dale has a very high floor, not just this week, but moving forward. At 40 and 41, I got Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir back-to-back, the 2 Bills receivers. I want to rank them higher, but the target share in Buffalo just looks too unpredictable from week to week to fully trust. Josh Allen spreads the ball around enough where everyone is going to produce at a decent rate. So the fact that Elijah Moore scored a touchdown last week, that was really annoying. James Cook could also dominate again. He has against the Dolphins in the past. So there's a chance that that just limits the opportunities if James Cook is scoring all the touchdowns. But I would think Keon Coleman offers the higher ceiling. That's what happened in week 1. And while Shakir has a decent floor, there's a chance that in year 2, Keon does overwhelmingly outproduce Shakir rest of season. So there's a chance that one of them falls off a cliff in value. There's also a chance that one of them skyrockets in value. And I also can't tell you exactly which one it's going to be. So my preference would be Keon Coleman, but I can't say definitively that either are a safe play. And if they burn you again, it wouldn't be that surprising. So Buffalo is just a little too random, a little too crowded to fully endorse. But in the top 41, I do think they have flex consideration. If you're swinging for the fence, betting on Josh Allen is never the worst bet to make, but I just don't feel confident the floor is safe enough to trust. So probably going to bench both of them, and I'm also probably benching both Packers receivers. I rank Matthew Golden above Romeo Doubs for the same logic as I rank the Bills receivers. I think there's higher upside with Golden, even though the floor is probably safer with Romeo Doubs. If you watch last week's game against Washington, Golden almost hit on 2 deep touchdowns. One of them was underthrown and the other one was overthrown just slightly. If they would have connected, one of them was a 35-yard touchdown and then the other one was a 90+ yard deep bomb waiting to click for that touchdown. So he could have put up 30+ points. It's possible that Golden would have had an elite production in week 2. The fact that Jaden Reed goes down definitely benefits him. They have extra practice time. I think Golden will be involved a lot more moving forward. And honestly, he reminds me a lot of Christian Watson's rookie season, where despite some miscues early on, some deep passes that just did not hit or were just straight up dropped, he can easily turn into a weekly top 25 play if they start to connect. If Love has a good connection with Golden, then it will turn into a very high ceiling in fantasy. I think Golden is a buy low candidate for sure. I think he will look much better as the season goes on. Rookies usually struggle. They usually have a much better second half of the season than first half. So it's kind of expected. It's been worse than I've thought, but the ceiling was on display. If those deep passes had hit, Golden would have been an amazing start in week 2. So he has that potential available to him, but if you just want to play it safe, go with Romeo Doubs. He'll see a decent amount of targets. Neither of them are more valuable than Kraft, and that's why neither of them are safe options. But I do think based on the upside swing, the offense is good in Green Bay, and if they score a touchdown, you're going to be happy. But guaranteeing the touchdown is a big liability. It's not a safe bet at all, and it's possible it all goes to Dontavian Wicks and Kraft once again. So no thanks with either, but if I'm starting one, I'll take the home run swing on Golden. And these are the last players I think you're like really considering in the low end flex territory. Moving forward, I think every player is a clear bench this week, and I think it's way too risky to trust. I would still roster them for sure, but in week 3, I'm going to be benching all these players. At 44, I got Hollywood Brown at the Giants, and if Worthy is going to return, then Hollywood is not as safe, definitely not as much volume headed his way. I would expect the second most targets for any Chiefs receiver to go to him. However, I'm not so sure that he's more valuable than Tyquan Thornton, who gets a lot of deep passes down the field. So as long as Worthy plays, I would definitely bench Hollywood. But if Worthy is inactive yet again, then Hollywood would skyrocket, definitely enter the top 30 in the rankings if Worthy can't go. But I think Worthy will play. I ranked Worthy top 10 for a reason. At 45, we got Chris Olave at Seattle. And Olave, in terms of targets, is elite. He's actually top 3, averaging 11 targets per game, but he's not turning it into any value whatsoever. He currently ranks as wide receiver 42 in scoring, and this week he gets the most difficult wide receiver matchup in the NFL. The Seahawks have only allowed 87 yards per game to the wide receiver position, and they've been the most difficult matchup in fantasy through 2 games. So definitely going to fade him. I don't trust Rattler on the road, and I need to see what Rattler looks like when he's not in a dome environment for me to feel confident at all. So even if Olave continues this elite target share, half the receptions don't even hit, and then they barely turn into any yards. There's almost never any touchdowns in New Orleans either. So no thanks with Olave. I faded him in the summer, and I'm going to be a big hater all year. If you want me to rank him higher, I'm just not going to do it. No thanks with Olave against Riq Woolen and the Seahawks. 46, we got Stefon Diggs versus Pittsburgh, and Diggs has upside. Can't pretend like he doesn't. I definitely don't fear the Steelers' defense so far. However, New England has a very random target distribution. If you told me that Kayshon Boutte dominates, or even Demario Douglas outperforms Diggs, wouldn't shock me. Even Austin Hooper and Hunter Henry could have much better games than Stefon Diggs. It's just kind of too crowded. The ball is spread around too much in the Patriots offense. So I don't trust any specific option, and although Diggs is tempting to play against Pittsburgh, I just don't want to trust it yet. I need to see some consistency from any specific player in New England to trust anyone other than Drake May right now in that offense. So no thanks with Diggs. The ceiling is there, but there's not much of a floor. And the same kind of applies with Troy Franklin. I would like to see it consistently with Franklin in order to bet on it. But in week 2, he looked amazing. He was really productive. Meanwhile, Sutton was pretty ass, and it's possible that does pivot back in favor of Sutton pretty quickly. So Franklin, definitely a very good pickup, has had good volume through 2 games. And although he scored a touchdown last week, I don't bet on it to repeat too often. So I need to see Franklin consistently prove it in order to trust him. He's definitely top 50, but not a safe bet, not in the top 35 this week, in my opinion. At 48, I also need to see Cooper Kupp produce consistently to trust him. He had a big bounce back in week 2, and Darnold looks way better after week 1. He looked like shit. So maybe it was just the Steelers matchup. They have some injuries in the secondary that are relevant. And I also think Torrey Horton is a relevant factor as well. Horton scored a touchdown and will emerge more and more as the weeks go by. But Kupp had decent volume. Definitely if Darnold can play that well again, then I'd be much more optimistic about Kupp moving forward. And week 1 was just so abysmal. That's why I can't fully trust him. A little too volatile from week to week to say for sure that you know what you're getting from Cooper Kupp. Darnold is also still a question mark, and I would like to see him play consistently as well before I trust any player in Seattle other than the running backs or JSN. Right now, Kupp is a little too unsafe to trust. Number 49, I have Elic Ayomanor versus the Colts, who did score a touchdown last week. The rookie had the only Titans touchdown on the season, and I think his role will be pretty consistent all year long. I don't see anyone really threatening him for targets other than Calvin Ridley. So I do like Ayomanor a lot. I told you last week to pick him up off the waiver wire. I did rank him, and I bumped him up only a few spots compared to last week's rank. So he was kind of touchdown dependent. I'd like to see it happen a little more often to rank as a good flex play, but there's actually a chance that he overtakes Ridley in terms of fantasy value. I doubt it, but it is possible. Cam Ward is pretty good, and Ridley definitely gets tougher matchups. That is for sure. So Ayomanor, a top 50 option this week. Definitely a good pickup off the waiver wire. And at number 50, I'm going to be fading Travis Hunter until he can prove it. He has decent volume. 7 targets per game is not bad, but it's not elite. And it's also not turning into any solid production. Even if he catches the passes, they barely go for more than 6 yards per reception. So this week against Houston, I am worried about it. I need to see the Jags prove it. And although Derek Stingley will be on Brian Thomas Jr. for most of the game, there's a chance that he does match up. If he could travel potentially and also line up on Travis Hunter as well. So the dual threat player is tempting to trust, but just hasn't been good enough yet. He's been outscored by Dyami Brown, the best receiver in this offense so far for fantasy purposes. So gonna fade Hunter. I need him to be more consistent before I start him. At 51, I'm also gonna bench Darnell Mooney at Carolina, who I think is still getting healthy from the shoulder injury. And last week's game plan was pretty unencouraging. They barely threw the ball against Flores' defense. Perhaps that was the right decision. I mean, they won the game on the back of Bijan. It definitely worked out. So I'm not going to panic on Mooney. I'm a believer in him long term, but until he actually plays well, you can't start him. The volume wasn't high enough last week. And although I was encouraged with some of the targets down the field, he was targeted in the red zone as well. I am a Mooney truther until I see it. I just can't rank him any higher than 51. So needs some consistency from pretty much every player in this tier. While they are very tempting, it's probably just a little too risky to actually bet on. Probably not going to happen. More often than not, you probably get burned. So a little too soon to feel confident, but I do think they have some value. Definitely should be rostered. That is for sure. These last players I will just run through just for the sake of mentioning them, but they're definitely players I'm benching. Shaheed gets the toughest matchup on the slate this week at Seattle, and I don't trust Rattler on the road. If it's not a dome game, I don't want to trust either Saints receiver. So even with a touchdown last week, no thanks on Shaheed, and no thanks on Hopkins, even though he scored 2 touchdowns in 2 games. The volume is just not there. Only 2 targets per game for Hopkins. And maybe they're always going to turn into touchdowns, but I don't want to trust that. The volume's just not high enough. And perhaps he's this year's Rashad Bateman. He scores 9 touchdowns, but even that is hard to bet on. I'm only trusting Flowers among the pass catchers for Lamar Jackson. At 54, we got Hunter Renfrow at Atlanta, who scored 2 touchdowns last week. He looked pretty good, but that's not going to repeat too often. The efficiency was pretty low. And meanwhile, Jalen Coker is on IR. I think you can bet on some volume to repeat. I don't fully trust Renfrow from a week-to-week standpoint. So going to bench him. I think it's a little too soon to fully endorse him, but you can pick him up and definitely stash him. It's not a bad investment. He looked pretty good last week, and the volume has been there. He's actually right in line in terms of points per game with Tetairoa McMillan, but he scored 2 touchdowns. Tet has scored none. Half of Renfrow's points are coming from touchdowns, and that's too dependent on that to trust. So no thanks with Renfrow, but kind of interesting option this week. At 55, I got Tyquan Thornton at the Giants, and I kind of want to flip him and Hollywood in the rankings. I kind of feel like Tyquan might be more valuable than Hollywood, given his deep targets with Mahomes. So against the Giants, I think he will be targeted at least a few times, but if Worthy's going to play, I'm not going to start either option behind Worthy. So no thanks with Tyquan this week. I might be ranking him literally like 15 spots too low, though. There is some high upside with Tyquan Thornton. At 56, we got Dyami Brown versus Houston, who's been the most valuable Jags receiver in fantasy, but I'm still going to trust Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter a little bit more. If it happens a third time, though, then I will probably flip the rankings and put Dyami above Hunter. He's only 6 spots behind Hunter in the ranks. At 57, I'm definitely benching Jalen Waddle at Buffalo. I do not trust the touchdown to hit once again. If we look at the last 3 games versus Buffalo over the last 2 years, there was 1 game when he was inactive. He's only averaging 4.5 points per game. 3.7 targets, 3.3 catches, 28 yards, and no touchdowns. Waddle is ass against Buffalo. They have his number. I'm not going to start him against the Bills. At 58, I'm also not going to start Thielen versus the Bengals, but I actually think Wentz could really boost the value for this receiving core. And if Thielen had just put up some good numbers in the first 2 weeks, then maybe I would trust him more. But he is not. He only has DFS value, and he's 35 years old. He might just be washed. It's possible. He just sucks. At 59, I haven't seen enough from Josh Downs either to trust, but I do think he is still too talented to drop. At some point, I think he'll figure things out. I think he's also still recovering from his ankle injury in the preseason. So I would hold on a bit longer, but it's not exciting. I don't think he's fully healthy yet, and that should get better over time. But maybe you don't have the patience, maybe you don't have the space to hold on to Downs. I get it if you want to drop him. At 60 and 61, though, I got Judy and Tillman, and I've seen enough from the Packers defense. I'm benching every skill player that isn't matchup proof against Green Bay. No thanks with Judy or Tillman. I think you're asking to lose, and I also think Dylan Gabriel is going to get some snaps. I think they're going to bench Flacco pretty soon. So no thanks with Judy or Tillman. I fear the Packers way too much, and I don't think there's a touchdown for anyone in Cleveland this week. 62, we got Kayshon Boutte, who could be more involved than Diggs. It's possible, but not going to bet on it. The Patriots' target share a bit too random to trust. And then Dontavian Wicks might be more valuable than Matthew Golden. He's going to step up with no Jaden Reed. Wicks will run routes, but I'm not convinced he's a safe play. Not at all. At 64, we got Josh Palmer, who's also the wide receiver 3 in his offense, could produce numbers, but I would rather bet on Keon and Shakir, but I might be underrating Palmer. I also might be underrating Marvin Mims, who could have the same upside as Troy Franklin or Sutton this week. It's possible against the Chargers he does hit on a deep touchdown. And then last player I'm going to mention is Isaac Tesla at wide receiver 66. At Baltimore, it's going to be a shootout. And even though Tesla has only seen 2 targets this season, he looks amazing. He looks really good, and I think they will use him more and more as the weeks go by. I wouldn't be shocked if he scored another touchdown on Monday night. So those are my rankings for week 3, my top 60 at the receiver position, and I feel really confident in the top 15. I think they're all locked into your lineup. There's some trepidation in the top 25, but I think all the players from Davante Adams to Brian Thomas Jr. will go over 10, 11 fantasy points, and I think they are safe starts. I would put them in the lineup if I had them. And then wide receivers 26 through 35 are my flex plays this week, and even though some players like A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Terry McLaurin, and even Calvin Ridley, Courtland Sutton do scare me quite a bit, I think they have a safe enough target share and touchdown upside to consider as at least flex options. I don't think they're bad starts if you have to trust them, if you don't have enough depth at the position. But starting with Tyreek Hill at 36, I think that's where I'm going to bench most players. There's still enough depth where you could get a great game out of everyone outside the top 35. But based on how I feel, I just don't think they're the best options this week. I'm going to fade everyone after Tyreek Hill. And then once you hit Hollywood Brown at 44, I think it's way too risky. I'm definitely not going to start them. But I would roster them if they're inside the top 51. This week, I don't think they have enough value where they have to be picked up. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. This one went pretty long, so I'm going to try and be faster next week, but we're still getting back into the groove. We're still hammering out the position. Hopefully next week, I keep it under an hour. But that's it for me. My name is Adam Riancho, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.